It's okay.
Did he say very nice?
Your WhatsApp did not reach.
Let me try again.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll try again.
We can do it in the coffee break, looking at each other.
Sorry.
That's okay. Okay, so it's my great pleasure as the co-chair of this session to welcome you back on our third day. We all know in Christianity the third day is an important day if we think about numbers. But I was also thinking about, reflecting on how much people experience something quite transformational, maybe is not a word that's too strong to use for what happened yesterday. You know, we're here in the Vatican, we're in an academy that is sponsored by a major religious community. If we think about where that religious community is right now, we're in between the Feast of the Ascension, when we remember Christ returns to the Father, and then we have this period of prayer before the Holy Spirit comes down on the Feast of Pentecost, which is also, of course, a Jewish feast as well. So we're in this period. So I think it's appropriate on the third day of our seminar to remember this. And also on a slightly more serious level, I would say, we have brought together in the two academies the science, the natural science to do with climate change, the social science. We'll talk more about this today, and also the connections between these two groups of knowledge and of actors as well. But we also have the religious faith and the tremendous motivation that people can have when they are inspired by their faith. And let's not forget, as the Pew Research Center shows in its data, there's 86% of the world's population belongs to a recognizable religion. So this is an enormous resource for us. So maybe, especially I ask maybe the social scientists to keep this in mind as well. It is part of our social system, Okay, so with those words, we're now going to turn to a very nice topic, social tipping points. And in our first section, in which Marcelo will join me to chair it, we're going to be talking about migration, especially forced migration. And then in the second section, we'll hand over to Vittorio and Judge Gallardo to talk about ethics and equity. So we're going to have these two sessions on social tipping points. So I don't want to take any more time away from our speakers. So I'm very, very happy to hand over now to Mary Waters, who's going to talk to us about climate migration and integration. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Sister. And thank you to all of the organizers and all the people who've worked so hard to bring us together. And I also want to send out a thank you to the all of you who have given talks, because I feel like I've been learning so much in the last few days, and it's been inspiring to me to learn about all of the innovation and all of the work that's being done. So, I need the clicker. Does anybody know where the slide advancer is? Yeah. Rewind the 15 minutes. Okay. Is it on? So I want to talk today about climate migration, and I have 4 points to make. And the first is that we have to pay attention to the politics surrounding both migration and climate denialism. because across the United States and Europe, there is a growing convergence between these two right-wing social movements. And some of the estimates that we're coming up with for migration are fueling the loss of social trust that we need both to welcome migrants and to deal with climate migration. So I want to talk about that for a moment. I want to talk about the different kinds of migrants that climate change is going to create. And I've been looking across research on climate migration, and we really have not been paying much attention to what happens after the climate migrants arrive, how we integrate them, how we welcome them, how we bring them into our community. I want to suggest that we can shape migration flows proactively if we approach this from a rational approach. And finally, I want to stress that migration can be a solution and a benefit, both for sending and receiving societies, and we need to recognize that. So quantitative studies of climate migration have focused on correlating rainfall, temperature with aggregate numbers. And what we know is that climate migration is already occurring. People are claiming asylum because that's the only way that they can claim to come into developed countries. But we know that climate migration is occurring, that it's also resulting in conflict, which is fueling migration. But at the individual level, we know these aggregate flows, but at the individual level, and qualitative studies show you can't, migration is multi-causal, and you can't say this particular person is leaving because of climate. And I think that sends us down a road that is not productive to try to identify climate migrants. Migration theory tells us a couple of very important theorems, which is that when people do move, they will move short distances, they will follow social networks if they can, and they will hope to return. So when we think about the types of climate migration that will occur, one is disaster migration. I've been studying Hurricane Katrina survivors for 20 years, and that is an example of disaster migration where people just went wherever they could in large numbers, and it is chaotic and it is rapid and large. Slow onset change, things like droughts, floods, rising temperatures, lead to both strategic migration, people deciding that they need to move for their livelihoods, and managed retreat, which is also a very last resort, that people will resist very much until they can't anymore. And finally, as Marcelo mentioned on Wednesday, these changes also create trapped populations, people who cannot or will not move, and they are often the worst off. So the policy debate about do we need a new category, which is raging, I think is not productive because governments will not be able to identify at the individual level who is a climate migrant. And it could be a political flashpoint. But I do think that we need to recognize that the developed world has contributed the CO2 emissions and are not bearing the brunt of damage. And we should think about visas for legal migration as reparations and as a way of managing migration. So the first point I want to make is that the fear of climate migrants is sometimes fueled by well-meaning people who are trying to get people upset about climate, activists who are trying to mobilize people. A recent report said that 1.2 billion people would be moving by 2050. This fuels worries. Here are some headlines, especially the British press seems to be really good at very awful headlines. Prophecy of doom, and this one of my favorites, climate change study predicts refugees going to Antarctica. So this kind of worry, if as a migration scholar, I can tell you that a recipe for anti-immigrant feelings is a rapid immigration from a low base, segregated and limited interaction between natives and immigrants, fears about economic insecurity and declining social mobility, and leaders who exploit these fears and use migrants as a scapegoat. This is a recipe for anti-migrant feelings. On the other hand, the long-run effects of immigration, we have volumes of research on this, is that integration of immigrants can be incredibly successful. That equal contact between natives and immigrants, slower growth of immigration, and leadership that frames immigrants as a benefit, we can find very good patterns of integration over time. So the importance of social trust, I think, can't be stressed enough, and that this is something that social scientists have to work on, because the decline of social trust is both a consequence and a cause of migration politics, and it is also very much undermining our ability to deal with climate change. So if we think about the integration of climate migrants, I think we need to increase the opportunities for strategic migration by accepting more migrants, by having visas assigned to countries hit hard by climate change. These strategic migrants, people who win these visas in whatever way we give them out, you could have a lottery for them, will send remittances home, which will help with adaptation and will also help with trapped populations who are left behind. They also will provide the social networks that will facilitate the successful integration of migrants who come afterwards, as well as disaster migrants. If you want to know where the disaster migrants will go, they will go to the places where people from their country have already gone. So the Central Americans coming into the US are following the people who have gone before. The North Africans coming into Europe are following the people who have gone before. So one thing that we need to focus on, though, is the receiving communities. So we need to focus on the justice for the receiving communities, because many of the places where these migrants end up are places where they are with other poor people who feel worried about the new migrants coming in. And so a social justice perspective will help. Disaster migrants come in and they are treated often as individuals and not as community. And if there's something that 40, 50 years of studies of disaster migration have told us, is that people want to be with members of their community, their neighbors and their families. And we need to think about that when we're relocating disaster migrants. And many of this will be internal displacement as well as international migration. So I want to just mention an example of something like this. So Buffalo, New York is a city that has been losing population for 50 or 60 years. Its peak population was 580,000 people in 1950. It's now down to 260,000. If you look at Buffalo, it has the land, housing, sewage infrastructure, water infrastructure to support hundreds of thousands of additional people. In 2019, the mayor declared Buffalo a climate change refuge. Of course, they also had 7 feet of snow and an emergency, so no place is a real refuge. But they want to attract migrants. And when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, there is a Puerto Rican population in Buffalo. They went on the radio, they advertised for people to come to Buffalo. They met the people at the airport with warm coats, which they really needed coming from Puerto Rico to Buffalo. And they mobilized family and community connections to find jobs. The local government expedited the certification of Spanish language teachers because they needed them in the school. And they, most of the people who relocated after Maria went to Florida, but Buffalo planned for, welcomed the migrants, integrated them into the community, and urban planners throughout the Great Lakes region are planning for both internal relocation and international relocation. And that's what many of our cities actually need. Across, especially cities in declining areas, really need people. And so this idea that we should be afraid of people coming in when in fact many cities are trying to attract people is a real contradiction. So if we think about developed countries right now, we have a fertility and aging crisis. Throughout Europe, the United States, increasingly in China, in Japan, South Korea, there's a declining population and aging population. So what we need to do is strengthen the institutions, the government capacity, and community ties in anticipation of a change we know is coming as this climate change is baked in. We need to develop plans quick for both the slow and the fast climate migration. And if there's one thing you take away, migration itself can be part of the solution because migrants support other migrants. And so if we seed migration from areas that need a flow to a new place, that is actually facilitating both this other strategic migrants and also disaster migrants. But we also need to address the inequalities in the destination areas. And that we've learned from refugee relocation that if refugees come in and get aid and the poor people in the neighborhoods where they're coming don't have that aid, it can exacerbate tensions between people. And then finally, what social scientists can contribute is number one, community matters in relocation after disaster. After the tsunami in Japan, they gave people the option of moving with their neighbors to a new place to rebuild, or they could go individually. But we often don't do that. Our emergency management is all about the first few minutes and helping people, but we need to think about how to put communities back together. This visa program that I'm thinking of, I know the politics of it are very hard, but I really think that we actually need a lot of immigrants, and we know what countries need to have people leaving. So we need to institute large numbers of visas, and we don't need to vet individuals for their skills or for their fleeing from a well-founded fear. We just need to say, here's some visas, people should come, we will welcome them. We need to think about how to restructure our institutions to foster the equal contact and sustained social interactions that we know help integrate immigrants. We need more research on the links between anti-immigration and climate skepticism and how we can combat that. And finally, I can't stress this enough, leadership matters in framing immigration and difference in a positive way. We need immigrants. Immigrants need to flee places that are unsafe. And this can be a successful solution, but we need leadership that will frame it in that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for getting us off to a great start. If I might just add to that, we have a little program here in Rome, because of course migration is a big issue in Italy as well, to help migrants register with us. It's called STRONG, which is an acronym for the activities, selection, training, research, orientation, and so on. And the first research we did with them was on the businesses which migrants found. And we got the migrants to do the research. One of the most interesting results was when a migrant starts a business, the first thing they do is employ an Italian, because they want the Italians to tell them where the markets are, where the contacts are. So they actually end up creating jobs for the Italians. Anyway, so, so now on that happy note, let's move to Carola Suarez-Orozco, who's going to give us a really important presentation, I think, on the effects of climate change on children. Thank you, Carola.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning. I'm so grateful to you all for having organized this meeting, and thank you for your interest and involvement in this important conversation. My role today is to draw attention to the role of climate change on children. While climate change concerns us all, the most significant threats are to the world's children. A 2021 UNICEF report which ranked countries based on how vulnerable children are on climate-related changes, determined that nearly half of the global child population is at extremely high risk of experiencing the adverse effects of climate change. I lost a slide along the way. Children are particularly vulnerable because their bodies and minds are still developing. And sorry, but there's a switch on my slide, so that makes things a little bit complicated. But so children are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change for various reasons, beginning with the fact that their bodies and minds are still developing. The impacts of climate disruptions can by themselves create havoc, or they multiply pre-existing vulnerabilities for already fragilely resourced children with decisive impacts that can last a lifetime. Further, children are also exposed at relatively higher rates than adults. And of course, there are important impacts on their future possibilities. This is the wrong slide. Sorry, this is the wrong PowerPoint. I apologize, but this is the wrong PowerPoint. Sorry. I'm going to continue going, but it's a much longer, more detailed PowerPoint. So the evidence suggests that while children's bodies and minds are uniquely vulnerable to pollution and extreme weather, their plight too often is under-considered in climate mitigation, in climate research, and in funding. And yet, it is clear that we are facing what UNICEF has termed a children's rights crisis. Children and youth are affected by eco-devastations, which include slow onset devastations. So in this presentation, I will cover the effects of climate change on children, considering three distinct groups of children. Children that are directly affected by environmental devastations, and that includes slow onset as well as rapid onset devastations. Children who migrate due to these climate-related disruptions, as well as children experiencing eco-anxiety, deeply concerned about the future sustainability of their environment. Broadly speaking, eco-devastations can be categorized into rapid onset shocks and slow onset shocks. Rapid onset disasters often result in displacements, and rapid onset devastations. Here we go. So rapid onset devastations include hurricanes, cyclones, floods, windstorms, and fires, while slow onsets include drought, water scarcity, environmental degradation, and air pollution. Rapid onset disasters often result in displacements, health emergencies, and immediate survival challenges, whereas slow onset events like droughts significantly affect essential resources like clean water. I'm going to give it up on the, sorry. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the most prevalent slower onset form of eco-devastations is related to drought and water scarcity. UNICEF estimates that 739 million children, nearly a third of the children across the world, are exposed to extreme water scarcity. These risks are not distributed evenly across regions. 64% of the children in the Middle East and North Africa and 55% of children in South Asia have inadequate access to potable water, while this is the case for 11% of children in Western Europe. There is clear evidence that eco-devastations are most immediately dangerous for children and youth residing in the lowest income countries in the metaphorical global south, areas where children's health is also already the most compromised. Notably, it is estimated that children will experience 80% of the physical health impacts of climate changes. Health risks are elevated as eco-devastations can disrupt access to clean water, food, and healthcare services, exacerbating existing health disparities. The mental health of children, while often overshadowed by immediate physical health needs, is also profoundly affected, which increase risks of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Educational access is compromised in regions affected by eco-devastations, with frequent school absences and reduced learning outcomes, particularly when water scarcity affects daily attendance. Turning to eco-migration, the UNICEF has declared that climate change has become a driver of human displacement, as my colleague has referred to. Between 2016 and 2021, an estimated 134.1 million people were classified as eco-migrants, although, as you note, it's often multiply determined, but 43.1 million of those folk are children. The vast majority were displaced by storms and floods. As we see here, children are displaced by storms primarily resided in the Philippines, India, China, and Bangladesh. And the UNICEF reports categorizes countries. So these are the top 4. In contrast, those displaced by flooding were predominantly displaced from India, China, the Philippines, Somalia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. Droughts precipitated migration for over 1 million children, mainly originating from Somalia, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan, while wildfires were the precipitating event for just under 1 million children eco-migration. Children displaced by wildfires largely originated from the global north, the United States, Canada, and Israel. Several points are worth noting. Firstly, eco-migration often results from multiple climate-related hazards, forcing families to seek safer or more habitable areas. Secondly, the disruptions from climate change impact livelihoods and health and can increase violence and unrest, leading to diverse migration motives. Thirdly, climate-induced displacements can be internal within a country or across international borders, each posing unique challenges for children. As Marcelo noted in his earlier talk on Wednesday, international displacements, however, add legal, cultural, and linguistic hurdles that intensify vulnerabilities. Lastly, although eco-migrants may be seen as ecological refugees, international law does not recognize them as refugees under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Thus, these displacements by environmental factors do not receive the same protections as those fleeing conflict or persecution, complicating legal processes for those seeking asylum internationally, which is why we need to have more flexible policies and set those in place. Now, turning now, as we think about eco-migration's impacts on children's development, displaced children are a particularly vulnerable population facing multifaceted challenges that can have profound impacts on their physical health, their mental health, and their educational opportunities. Children displaced by climate change face numerous physical health challenges. Physical injuries may result from violence, accidents, or hazardous conditions incurred prior to displacement, during the journey itself, as well as in refugee camps. Displaced children who reside in refugee camps are exposed to high rates of infectious diseases due to overcrowded living conditions, poor sanitation, and limited access to clean water. Additionally, vaccination coverage is frequently incomplete, increasing the risk of outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases. Malnutrition caused by inadequate food supplies further compromises well-being. The mental health impact, well, not yet. The mental health impacts on displaced children are also profound. Experiencing or witnessing traumatic events, including natural disasters and the loss of homes or loved ones, can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. The stress and uncertainty of displacement exacerbates these issues, impacting children and youth's daily life and educational engagement. Educationally, displacement leads to interrupted schooling, delayed enrollments, increased dropouts, and significant learning gaps. Barriers such as documentation issues, language differences, and financial constraints not only disrupt current learning, but also have lasting impacts on future educational opportunities. Children and youth who are not immediately and directly disrupted or displaced by climate change are also responding to this planetary threat. Best personified by Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, eco-anxiety is defined as chronic fear of environmental doom. Emerging evidence suggests that youth are significantly more likely than their elders to be worried about the impacts of climate change on their future. Responses can include anxiety, worry and fear, grief and mourning, guilt and shame, anger and frustration, helplessness and hopelessness, and numbness. Eco-anxiety is also associated with deep worries and pessimism about the future. The majority of youth in a large-scale survey drawn from 10 countries, for example, reported that because of climate change, the future was frightening, humanity was doomed, and that their family's security would be threatened. Notably, there is very little systematic research on the experiences of eco-anxiety in low and middle income countries. Indeed, most of what we know about eco-anxiety is drawn from research from high-income countries from the global north. While at first glance, the eco-anxiety issue seems to be primarily an issue of the global north, this may be a function of where media attention and research is focused. The global survey of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds from 10 countries that I referred to earlier revealed that eco-anxiety is widespread across countries. The majority respondents across all of the participating countries were worried about climate change. 84% of the youth who participated were at least moderately worried. 59% were very or extremely worried. More than 45% of the respondents indicated their feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily functioning, and the majority reported a pessimistic view about the future. Notably, the trends were most extreme in the data drawn from the 3 countries that are most highly impacted by eco-devastation: the Philippines, India, and Brazil. Thus, unsurprisingly, the evidence suggests that children and youth most immediately affected by climate disruptions are even more likely to report an array of eco-anxiety concerns. Turning to recommendations, collectively, we must strive to ensure a livable planet for children who are most profoundly impacted by climate change. We must begin by recognizing the profound impacts for children and youth and keep them squarely in mind as we develop policies and practices to foster climate resilience, including coming from this meeting. Children and youth should never be an afterthought. We should recognize that children in varying regions of the world are being affected quite differently. Some immediately living with the daily realities of climate change and devastation, others displaced, and still others living with the cloud of eco-anxiety. Strategies to address the realities, experiences, and prospects of children and youth will need to be tailored accordingly. For those who are living with eco-devastations, it is crucial we enhance resilience planning and climate adaptation strategies with a focus on the unique needs of children, which include educational needs. We must improve health and social services in regions prone to both rapid and slow onset events, ensuring children's needs as a priority. For children, so we need to be working on, well, I'm going to just quickly try to wrap it up. Apologies for the difficulties with the slides. For children and youth displaced by climate change, becoming eco-migrants and eco-refugees, we must recognize that climate migration is a reality and will only continue to grow. We should begin by supporting immigration policies that recognize and provide protection for those children. For those living with eco-anxiety, we must address the mental health impact of climate change on children, focusing on both preventive and responsive strategies. And looking towards solutions, we need to cultivate resilience by helping children, by empowering them through cultivating their sense of agency and collective action. The problem-solving oriented work gives them a sense of meaning and brings together communities, decreasing their sense of learned helplessness and efficacy. Lastly, and here I will leave much of the last word to my colleague, Dr. Tina Christie, we need to promote educational initiatives that integrate climate science, resilience, and sustainability into our school curriculum, empowering children and youth to face the future environmental challenges. Students should not only develop critical thinking about the real world challenges, but also learn about green jobs and careers around sustainability. In closing, this is a global child rights crisis, and we need to build into the work we do a child-centric, targeted set of supports. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Carola. I think with this very impassioned and well put together presentation, we certainly won't, in this group at least, be treating children as an afterthought. I think that's a very good way of putting it. Thank you so much for that. So now we'll turn to Mona Foreman, who will give us a talk about Santuario Frontera. Thank you very much.
Honored to be here. Thank you for this invitation. I'm a political theorist at the University of California, San Diego, and I direct the UCSD Center on Global Justice. Begin the slide. Where we focus on community-based solutions to poverty, climate disruption, and accelerating migration in the US-Mexico border region. Today, I'll share a regional story in the spirit of this meeting, but we really see our region as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities faced by vulnerable people across the world: political violence, climate disruption, deepening inequality, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, and border building everywhere. I live and work a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego, Tijuana is a lightning rod for American nativism. In recent years, tens of thousands of Mexican, Central American, and Haitian migrants waited at the wall for asylum that never came, too often reviled by the public as a nuisance or an infestation. The language was terrible. Many sat in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, exposed to a global pandemic and separated forcibly from their children. It has been devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Ambiguous asylum policy in the US and the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is now drawing even more people north. Conditions are intensifying again every day, and climate change will accelerate these flows. Everyone tends to see northward migration in this part of the world as a function of violence and poverty. And of course, this is true. But climate change, again, is a threat multiplier. It makes poverty and food insecurity worse, aggravates violence, and ultimately compounds the reasons why people take the risk, leave their homes, and walk north. A recent UN survey found that 72% of arriving migrants at the US southern border identified agricultural instability as a major factor in their decision to walk north. Two preliminary geopolitical comments before I share our work. First, as Mary pointed out, international agencies do not see these people as refugees, but as economic migrants drawn toward a better life. So they're not entitled to asylum or international refugee protection under the Geneva Convention. By mid-century, climate change is projected to displace millions, as many as 1 billion or more people. Our commitment here to resilience must include serious and central attention to the dramatic demographic shifts we will all soon face. And we really need to retool our language. In the US, we often refer to waves of northward migration as caravans, where the particularity of human struggle dissolves into an abstract movement, an invasion to be grasped in its magnitude from above. When depicted aerially within a mass of others, the migrant loses her own story. Her reasons become invisible, her rights easier to violate, fueling public fear and ugly political tropes about infestation. So we really need to rethink our language. Second geopolitical issue. As climate migration accelerates, there is deepening contention between the migration community on the one hand and the conservation community on the other, between those who advocate for migrants' rights and safe resettlement and those who prioritize ecosystem, wildlife habitats, and biodiversity loss. We created this infographic recently for the IUCN to illustrate global hot zones where climate change is intensifying this clash and the need for more strategic, cooperative migration planning. Our border zone in San Diego, Tijuana is one of these zones, an epicenter of both accelerating migration and dramatic biodiversity loss. Finding common ground, very literally common ground for nature and people, is our priority in the Center on Global Justice. We're a team of social scientists, urban designers, architects, engineers, environmental and public health researchers, and artists based at the University of California, San Diego. To carry out our work, we've developed a network of sanctuary spaces on both sides of the border wall called the UCSD Community Stations, where we partner with border communities to build spaces of dignity and sanctuary for nature and people, including the largest migrant sanctuary in the US-Mexico border region, which I'll share with you momentarily. We have 4 stations in total, 2 on each side of the wall. Our campus is payload up there in yellow. Within minutes from all of them, each station is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between our campus and a network of community-based agencies. I'll briefly share one of them with you at the edges of Tijuana. I want to preface that we are keenly attuned to power dynamics when universities arrive in communities. Academic culture is filled with vertical assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us. We're committed instead to horizontal practices of mutual learning and co-production, engaging migrant communities as partners with knowledge and agency. Everyone contributes, everyone learns, and we do things together in the border region that no one could possibly do alone. Okay, let me set the scene. When migrants arrive in Tijuana, most of them land in the informal canyon settlements at the western periphery of the city. We work in the Los Laureles Canyon, immediately adjacent to the border wall and home now to 100,000 people. Can you start? Thank you. This video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious settlements that have sprawled on its slopes. This site sits just 30 minutes from our US-based campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in this region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides, exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change and the informal building practices of arriving migrants. Laureles lacks water and waste management, so much of the trash and tons of sediment is siphoned northward through sewage drains carved into the border wall by US Homeland Security. Just brilliant. It all ends up in the US side, in a protected estuary, It's a hot mess and really illustrates this conflict between human and natural systems and a stunning lack of collaboration between the US and Mexico. So, enter UC San Diego. We've assembled a binational coalition of nonprofits and universities, state and municipal agencies to protect unsquatted lands, parcels in the settlement with nature-based green infrastructure. The Cross-Border Commons, as we call it, is a binational conservancy that links the informal settlement in Mexico with the US estuary, forming a continuous eco-social envelope, a sponge, really, a sponge, really, that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared by both sides. Our UCSD Alacran community station is located in one of these conservation islands in the most precarious and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization that built a refugee camp here for hundreds and over time thousands of Central American and Haitian refugees navigating prolonged asylum processes in the US and Mexico. Several years ago, we joined forces to increase shelter capacity. In our work in Tijuana, we often approach and negotiate with local factories to subsidize building materials. Multinational factories in Tijuana or maquiladoras typically situate themselves strategically near the zones where migrants land to benefit from easy access to cheap labor. So we knock on the door and we propose an ethical loop where the factory should invest in the housing of their workers. Some are receptive and they agree to work with us to test ways that we can utilize their materials to support housing. Here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquila, building a prototype for our Alacran station, retrofitting their prefabricated metal shelving systems into structural, you see them, scaffolds for housing. So Santuario Frontera broke ground last year. Here you see a team of migrant residents skilled in construction, installing the Mecalux frames as roofing systems. We're also healing the topography, creating hydrofiltration channels, gabions, terracing, and water collection systems to demonstrate that migrant housing need not compromise, but can actually help restore local habitat. The site now houses 1,800 people, and as I said, has become the largest migrant sanctuary in the US-Mexico border region. Once completed, the site will accommodate an additional 3,000 people through a combination of dormitory spaces and family units for women and children. The project was profiled in the New York Times last year for its unconventional development model, and in Bloomberg just 2 weeks ago for our focus on longer-term habitation, social inclusion, ecological restoration, and for generating jobs. The site includes spaces for vocational training, fabrication, and small-scale economic development, including a resident-owned construction cooperative that is building out this site and will remain intact for future jobs to circle income back into this community. Now, this is a translatable model of local collaboration between a public university, a faith-based organization, and a multinational factory. And with so much momentum and philanthropic support, we are now transforming the site into a full-on sanctuary neighborhood with social services, a hydroponics farm, an industrial kitchen, and this summer, an on-site health clinic with a consortium of regional medical schools. A few months ago, huge victory, the state of Baja California helped fund an elementary and middle school on site. There's no more effective method for integrating children into the life of a community than education. This is little Amal. You may know of her, the 14-foot Syrian refugee girl puppet that was walking across the world. We hosted her at the site a few months ago. There's so much more to say. When migrants first arrive, they have immediate needs of food, water, medicine, and shelter, urgent needs of the body, and providing these needs is the proper charitable response of an ethical society. But hospitality is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. Video. Migrants need to be integrated into the civic, social, and economic life of the city. Staying needs to be an option, needs to be a right. In an era of escalating climate migration, we need to evolve from hospitality thinking to inclusion thinking. I'd like to close with a note about collaborating across borders as the migration crisis accelerates. Despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric designed to divide us, our region is a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future here is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love, justice. These things don't stop at walls. Border zones are unrelentingly porous places. Ultimately, we want to change public perceptions about interdependence across borders. We want to cultivate a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or the documents you carry in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a disrupted civic space. So we curate unwalling experiments that dissolve the wall, using visual tools like these diagrams and radical maps to reimagine eco-social interdependence and cooperation. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border cultural action through one of the sewage drains that the US had brilliantly carved into the wall between Laurelus Canyon and the estuary in the US. We negotiated a permit with US Homeland Security to transform the drain into an official port of entry going southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-representation as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration officials were waiting on the other side of the wall to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, representatives from both municipalities, and border activists from around the world. And as we moved together southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater and plastic flowing northward toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing visualized the conflicts and interdependencies of our border region. And the great takeaway was that protecting the vulnerable US estuary demands shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. But in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between nation and nature are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the US and Mexico. These aerial photos document precise moments where the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems. May I have one more minute? Collides with natural systems, illustrating powerfully what dumb 19th century sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus map then reimagines this continental border zone without the line. Mexus dissolves the border into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems bisected by the wall. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory: tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. The end of my talk, and stretching to the global scale, is a visualization project we call the political equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30 and 38th parallels north. Along this trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds: the US-Mexico border at San Diego, Tijuana, the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere, the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the main routes from North Africa into Fortress Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian border, a cauldron of burning injustice that has exploded once again in the most horrific way, India, Kashmir, a site of persisting territorial conflict since partition, the border between North and South Korea, China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, it's all there. Now, visualizing this political equator in red alongside the climatic equator below in green was an astonishing discovery for us, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. And when these parallel equators are applied to the Pierce-Quincunxial projection, from above, the Arctic is centered with its melting ice caps detonating sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and again, human displacement. So in the end, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and the dramatic movement of peoples is the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as I said at the beginning, and as we're emphasizing here, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours, and certainly like yours. And there's great hope in this from the perspective of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thanks to the three of you for these three beautiful, terrifying, really impressive presentations. We started off so well today. So now I'm going to hand over to Marcelo, who's going to handle the next part of our meeting.
Thank you so much. Very difficult to follow those three presentations. Just three brief reflections, and then I want to invite a few speakers for their interventions. First, from the latter to the former. Thank you, Fauna. That's the most heavily trafficked border in the Northern Hemisphere. The wound that separates Mexico and the United States. Just a note to remember, it was the Bracero program that began the largest flow in United States history, and today the US has 4 times more immigrants than the second largest country of immigration, Germany. So that brings us to the topic of politics, which is an issue I think as both Carola and Mary suggested, we need to more systematically address. But it was the guest worker program, the Bracero program, that created the largest migration flow into the history of the United States. Immigrants are not workers. Bracero means armed. Immigrants are human beings. You can't have immigrants without their children, the topic of Carola's presentation. Because I've been in the field of immigration for something like 4 decades now, Mary and I share this in common. We were graduate students at Berkeley together, actually. And that is, what is new is often not true. And what is true is often not new. So, first, a kind of a reflection, and then I want to invite some of the speakers. And this is a question for our colleagues. The largest flows of migration today are not from the south to the north. They're south-south pattern. So in the north, at least in the United States, and again, this is a country that has 4 times more immigrants than any other country, international. We love immigrants looking backward. It's all very photoshopped and it's wonderful. Our Irish ancestors, our Italian ancestors, our Chinese ancestors, everything is beautiful looking backward. In the here and now, there's always been panic. Political panic, demographic panic, economic panic, cultural panic. 150 years ago, the panic was over the Eastern European Jews and the Catholics from Ireland and Italy. They're never going to assimilate. They're never going to. Fast forward, until very recently, all of the members of the United States Supreme Court were either Jews or Catholics. If a chancellor 150 years ago would have told you, relax, the Jews and the Catholics are going to do very well in the United States, they would have kind of ushered me out of the room gently and put me in a corner. So the panic is always in the here and now. There's a new level of panic, I think, that we need to be mindful of. But essentially, this is a political problem. It's a political concern. So I'd like to invite our colleagues to reflect upon. We have with us the president of the University of Massachusetts System, who is a highly regarded United States congressman, to help us, at least in the United States case, think about the issue of the politics of immigration, because this is now will define the next election in the United States.
Thank you, Marcelo. I can't help but reflect on a couple of years ago when I had the opportunity to present here at the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences on a great summit on the post-truth era in the world. And when we think about and I've thought a lot about that over the last couple of days when looking at the issue of climate crisis and migration. We have an issue, it's not just in the United States, it's around the world where evidence and the truth and facts are more difficult. We talk about people I have my own truths, as if that's a good thing. So I've thought a lot about that. And Marcelo, what you just articulated, in my family, my grandparents immigrated from Ireland, as you say, and immigration was a great thing. The challenge for us, I think, is to move us into a direction where we get back to truths. The truths are self-evident, but they're based on facts and science, and our politics aren't going to work until we get there. I reflected on the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, who had great comments here in the opening session, and talked about young people, and that's where the answer is. We have to get to truth. We need to have a society that holds people accountable for what's true and what isn't, for what the facts are, for what the facts are not. And lying should be something that is punishable in some way by a society. And we need to do more of that in the United States. We have a number of immigrants and migrants coming to Massachusetts, and it's become a real political issue, difficult political issue for Governor Healey, but it's a major issue in the presidential race. People shouldn't be allowed to lie to themselves, and politicians who ought to be smart enough shouldn't be allowed to demagogue on this issue. And it's exactly what is happening in the United States. People demagogue on this issue. My own hometown in Massachusetts, Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a center where Greek immigrants and Irish immigrants, and now we have the second largest population of Cambodian Americans who have immigrated to Lowell. When the governor wanted to locate a migrant residents in a UMass Lowell facility, some of the liberals in Lowell stood him and said, well, no, not here. No, can't you find someplace else? We need to hold each other accountable. I love the presentation on what language we need to use. We all have to hold people accountable for the language they use. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I'm very concerned about the presidential election. I served 14 years in the United States Congress. We we debated immigration and immigration policy. We had John McCain and Ted Kennedy agreeing on a bill, and nothing could get done because of demagoguery. So I hope that we get to the issue of how do we hold a society accountable for what is truth, for what's a lie, for what science says, for what the facts and evidence say. I think that's a challenge that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, President Meehan. I have President Von Braun, I have Virgilio, and Carola.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these very important presentations and your analyses. And I want to add from a natural science perspective an aspect which must deeply worry us. That is the consequences of severe stress on the epigenetic. I say so because that was not mentioned in your presentation. What's happening there in the context of severe famine stress, migration stress with children? The science in that field has progressed in the last 5 years very fast. The consequence of severe stress through epigenetics is it's passed on intergenerationally. So curing the migration problem with treating the current severe problems, integrating stressed migrants, is not covering the full consequences, because 2 or 3 generations on, these epigenetic consequences, they are not DNA changes, they are consequences for switching on and off genes, are showing themselves in severe consequences of neuropsychology, etc. We know that from science, not only in animal models, but in intergenerational analyses of the famine stress of the Dutch population and the German populations after 45, 46, and there is more. So I think we need to bring this consequence into the equation. And the suffering of people who are 2nd and 3rd generation out of severe stress situations needs to be part of the equation. I wonder if eco-stress is not part of the story. It may not be scientifically proven so far, but that would be a hypothesis which we should put on our science agenda.
Thank you, President Von Braun, Virgilio, and then Carola.
Well, thank you for 3 fantastic and very compelling presentations. Thank you so much. I'd like to make a connection between what you've presented today and Pope Francis' speech yesterday about an ecological debt and the figure of 80% of emissions coming from the developed world. And the question is how to pay for this debt. And your presentations make me think that the best way of paying this debt is through investment in children and migration, right? I mean, you gave all the evidence for that. And let me share you a thought. I think Fauna's sanctuaries are fantastic. But what would be your thought on having sanctuaries in the source of migration? Carola spoke about this eco migration, no? Eco, what was the word that you used? Eco migration that associate disasters and vulnerability and so on. Shouldn't we invest in resilience in those areas so that they could adapt to climate change, which is a case of climate injustice because they haven't created a problem, but they're suffering from the problem. And that just make me remember a personal testimony. When I was a young student, I traveled throughout the world backpacking, and I went to Paris and Germany. And at that time, migration from Portugal was a big problem. And what happened 50 years later? As a result of investment in infrastructure and development in Portugal, there is zero migration from Portugal. Actually, the opposite. Portugal receives people from those countries. So shouldn't the US think of having a similar approach to Central America? Invest heavily, tens of billions of dollars in sustainable development of Central America so that we could build resilience and avoid the tragedy of children that you so well spoke about.
Thank you. Thank you, Virgilio. Exactly the same is the case for Spain and France. And Virgilio, well-planned migration resulted in the mayor of Paris, the child of Spanish immigrants in France. Carola, you're next, then Andy, then David, and then Sunita, and Mary.
Okay.
For one moment.
I just wanted to respond quickly to say that Mexico now has below replacement fertility and labor shortages. And most of the people at the southern border are coming from all over the world, but not from Mexico. Mexico is now dealing with immigration. So this is a natural process. And I think the Biden administration is trying to invest in the sending countries, but stymied by very many ways. But in fact, economic remittances from migrants dwarf our foreign aid budget. And so the natural process of immigration helps to develop the places from which people come. So I don't think it's an either or of foreign aid versus migration, but both actually move towards the same target.
Thank you, Mary. Carola, quickly.
I wanted to reflect a bit on the issue you brought up, Marty, around public perceptions of immigration, but also to the issues we heard so clearly yesterday from our governors and mayors and around resistance to the narrative of climate change. And that is, in fact, one of the biggest issues that we are facing as we try to move forward in doing this work. And I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning yesterday thinking about, how we need to shift the narrative. And I think images of polar bears floating on ice, on ice, ice floats is powerful, but it's too distant for so many people. And I would argue that only the most cynical folks would not be brought up short by the compromised well-being of children, including their own being so clearly at stake. So I really think that bringing attention in the eco dialogue about just how vulnerable children are, children all over the world, but right here, right in your own homes, in the very near future, is, I think, a way to begin to shift the conversation. Polar bears are adorable, but not everyone's moved by a polar bear. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hassel.
Well, thank you so much for the splendid presentations this morning. I want to address some issues which, in my eyes, are quite important for the moral analysis. Ethics distinguishes very clearly between duties of omissions and duties of action. This is a basic principle of ethics, and everybody who thinks about it has to recognize it. I have a duty not to kill anybody, but I cannot have a duty to help billions of people because I do not have resources to help a billion of people. So that is a clear asymmetry. And legal systems usually focus on rights that defend them, not rights that entitle them. However, there is one very important conceptual issue. Compensation for damage is not a right of to a positive benefit from the other side, but it is undoing the wrong that one has inflicted on another people. And therefore, it's very important to understand that while I do not think that every person who has a grievance in the world can go to the places where there are no grievances, that simply doesn't work, persons who have been damaged by other countries should have a right. And therefore, in many aspects, climate refugees have a greater moral title than some of the persons that are listed in the Geneva Convention, because not in every case the victims of persecution in the Geneva Convention have been harmed by the countries that are supposed to host them. So I think this is a very important point that has to be made in order to explain why we owe something to climate refugees. Whether we do it by getting them visa or by helping the country where they are, it's a difficult question. We need a mixed system, and we also need, when we have migrant policies, two types. We have to distinguish between two types of migrants. Ones that are taken in for moral reasons, and the others because they are very useful for the country. And only a mix can generate political acceptance in the country. And this is the last point that I want to mention. I think that Professor Waters is completely right, that social trust is one of the basic aspects of the functioning of every community, but particularly of democratic communities. Democratic communities need more social trust than other communities. In a traditional monarchy, if everyone trusts the king, that's fine. But in a democracy, people have to trust each other. And the acts of trust are much, much more bigger. And on this issue, we see a collapsing of trust. You were completely right, President Meehan, that this is one of the most hot agenda in the United States. And since it's not at all unlikely that we will have enormous backlash in November, not unlikely, let me tell you as a German, the results of Merkel's generous policies of 2015, everybody agrees that the rise of the AfD was due to that. Even the admirers of Angela Merkel says she is the mother of the AfD. Of course, we wanted the opposite. But the fact that we have now a party more than 20% that is xenophobic, even against the EU, some want to work together with Putin, would not have been possible without an opening of the borders that was not based on a general consensus. And this is very sad, but it's a fact that a politician has to keep in mind. That is what I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Vittorio. We're not going to have the, okay, sorry. 30 seconds.
Just very briefly, obviously moral distinctions are essential, and better interventions to stem the root of migration are essential, but perfection is too often the enemy of the good, and resilience is a pragmatic issue, which is why we're intervening locally, where we have access and agility to move quickly. And I would say the same to the moral argument as well. Yeah.
And then David.
Well, just a few quick points. Firstly, I very much appreciated the focus on children, but also wanted to make the point that we need to consider also the effects on the mother and the fetus. And some work that we've been doing with our colleagues in West Africa shows that with pregnant women, subsistence farmers who have to work because they have to feed their family, you can show the effects of extreme heat exposure on the fetus, on the fetal heart rate, possibly epigenetics, we don't know yet. But this is having profound effects on pregnancy outcomes, no doubt. There's already good evidence that it increases the risk of premature labor, increases the risk of stillbirth. And so this impact on children starts well before they're born. And we need to take that into account in any adaptation strategies that we're proposing. So that's an urgent priority. The second point I wanted to make was about the importance of understanding the mechanism by which climate change is impacting on migration. And there may be different impacts according to whether it's extreme heat exposure, so you can't work or you can't harvest your crops, or whether it's floods, in which case you may be able to return, but if it's extreme heat exposure, you're probably much less likely to return to your point of origin. And droughts. So each of these have different adaptation strategies, different approaches to reducing the consequent migration. We need to understand those. The third very brief point was about shrinking cities. And I was very taken by the example of Buffalo, but Buffalo is not alone. There are many tens of shrinking cities around the world. And one of the things I think this meeting could do is, just as you've done with the mayors of major emitting cities, bring together the mayors of shrinking cities to say, what can we do to offer a climate sanctuary that would also be beneficial to our shrinking cities? So it's something that you might consider in the final thoughts about what to do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Try to be brief on a couple of points. First, I think that when we talk about this, the distinction between refugees and migrants is pretty important, in particular when we talk about movement in the global south, and at which point people that can be climate refugees become long-term migrants. And from Ethiopia, in Uganda, we see more and more of this case, and the policy response has to be different. And obviously, we will have the question of the small island states, because for a number of them, the question is where they will be moving, because they will have to move. So that will not by creating, as we were saying yesterday, hyper-local resilience, that we will address their specific needs. The other point I want to make is how some of the mitigation policies we have implications for migration and is linked to labor shortage. If you look about a number of policies we are putting in place in the agricultural domain, for instance, in Europe, either in the European Union or Switzerland, the type of practices we need to ask our farmers to do to be more sustainable are more labor intensive. And there is a labor shortage. And there is just an economic equation. So if then you go there and you ask, okay, how you can do it, they say, we need cheaper labor that will be provided by migrants. But asking us to be adopting these practices and not providing us the right labor force is just inconsistent. And sometimes they end up, in the street, because we ask them to do things that doesn't add up. Third, on Monday, I was talking about the official development assistance and how we don't do enough on development. And I just want to really flag the fact that in the last couple of years, most OECD countries have changed drastically the way to count how much they spent on refugees within their borders. So when you look at the official development assistance numbers that have been now increasing, actually it's because we are shifting money that we spend to support countries in need to taking care of people that reach war territories. And it's no more marginal. For the UK, 1/3 of their number on official development assistance is about counting the money they spent on the refugee on this. And because the overall amount of money doesn't increase so much, it means we still spend less and less in trying to solve the problem where they are at the source. And so, the illusion of numbers are pretty important. And finally, I will say that when we deal with the refugees, the question of education of children is pretty important. And because more generally, I was on a global food security conference last month, and people asked me, okay, what is the most important adaptation measure for agri-food system? I hate this type of question, because actually we need to do more things. But I finally answer girl education, because human capital become more and more important in the world of tomorrow. And a lot of the inequality that we were discussing in the last 2 days are linked to that. So we should never forget this kind of more long-term impact. And as it has been said in one of the presentation also, children education will be key to do the societal transformation that we were discussing. Because we need to play in the next 25 years with these different cohort of people that through different education and different mindset will change. It will be very difficult to change the behavior in terms of food waste or other things, for instance, of people that are 50 years old today. But the society will change because we will add more cohort of people that are a bit better educated on some of the questions we try to tackle. And that will be the structural change we need, and it has to be factored in the policy aspect of it.
Thank you so much. I have 3 minutes. Remember Goya, 3 minutes. And we have Sunita. Mary, you want to do? No, Sunita, Governor Hilo, and Joyce. So 1 minute each. Sunita, 1 minute.
Not overstating the fact that this is a complex issue and that we cannot very easily call people climate refugees is very important, even though we need to understand the exacerbating factor of climate change on the reason people move. Secondly, the fact is we talked about cities. In our part of the world, we are seeing cities grow because of internal migration, putting a huge stress on the cities. And the third point linked to that is when COVID happened, we saw massive out-migration of migrants from cities going back to villages. And that then pointed to the fact that if you did, and not underestimating again that resilience is such a simple thing, but the fact is if you invest back on the land, invest back in people, invest in natural resources, you create conditions why people do not leave. And we have documented reverse migration. Thank you. I stuck to a minute.
Governor.
Thank you. I want to thank the presenters for that information on migration. My position on this matter is that migration is going to increase unless we take a very serious decision on what next. Both internal migrations within the countries, within the region, and even international. And that's the reason why we continue to say that for those countries in the global south who are suffering the brunt of climate change, which is not their own creation, we should be able to support them to be resilient so that there is no need for them to move. But as long as we continue to deny and hope that, something miraculous will happen, the only miraculous thing that's going to happen is this migration, and you are not going to stop it. So I think we need to we have a moral responsibility to look at this matter and see how best we deal with it. And I can tell you, migration is going to increase unless we make a very calculated move to support those who are aggrieved.
Thank you, Governor. Joyce, we're going to have a general discussion. So if you can save your questions for the general discussion, then I will see it as a victory that we ended in time. We started yesterday with Kant. I am not going to end with a Hegelian synthesis of all the extraordinary papers that were presented this morning. Let's have a coffee.
No, I don't need it, but I will speak without. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very touching and moving. Perhaps to our Chancellor Marcello, but Sister Herren. Thank you so much. I know. Thank you. Perhaps Chancellor Marcello, but
Thank you.
We have a very dense program, so please take your seats and let us begin.
I don't know if you need this or not.
No, I don't need
you.
No, I don't
You're
know.
a man of the word. We can.
We need to make it. Just to, yeah, just make an offer.
It's good to see all of you again. During the lunch break, we will have the protocol signed by the Holy Father, the mayors and the governors yesterday. For all the academicians that would like to sign, we will set up a table so all of the participants are invited to sign the protocol. Thank you. Professor Hossel.
Thank you very much. We have now a session on on social tipping points, ethics and equity. Ethical questions have come up often during our deliberations, and I think it's very important that they're addressed, and they're addressed not only from a philosophical point of view, but also from a legal point of view, because a law, after all, is the system that tries to implement, to a certain amount, justice in an institutional way. Judge Roberto Andres Gajardo and I myself are chairing, and since I will be the first speaker, I pass now to you the short introduction, since we are very much under a time stress. Please, a very, very short introduction, not more than 20 seconds.
Muchas gracias, profesor Hosle. Buenos días a todas y todos. Vamos a empezar esta etapa de las exposiciones con un tema sumamente importante, vinculado a la centralidad de la doctrina franciscana, que es cómo juega la ética, cómo juega la equidad en el conflicto que trae aparejado el cambio climático. Así que es un honor para mí presentar al profesor Vittorio Hosle para que haga su reflexión sobre ética y cambio climático.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Since I've only 10 minutes, I will drop the first page that deals with a question that all of you already know, namely the fact that carbon dioxide would change the atmosphere is not a recent discovery. Svante Arrhenius in the 1890s had calculated, basically corrected, what the impact of a certain amount of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere would be. So it is not so that people did not know what was going to happen. They could have known it since the 1890s, this as a beginning. So it is clear, however, that Arrhenius underrated completely the speed in which we would achieve the amount of CO2 emissions that would change the climate up to the amount that it does, because of course in the late 19th century the Industrial Revolution was limited to small parts of Europe and the United States and Canada, so it was not yet a global phenomenon, and he also had no real moral compass. He said, well, if the temperature goes up in Scandinavia, it will be quite nice. It's quite cold here, so we should look forward to that. And this is, of course, a very Scandinavia-centric point of view. The main reason for the actual situation was also not lack of knowledge. Many of the dangers confronting us have been known for decades to scientists and could certainly have been explored more in depth and communicated to a broader public much earlier if there had been a political will. Why was there none? The answer that brutal economic interests hid the truth is certainly not wrong, but it is unilateral. Unlike in the case of the tobacco industry, the forces supporting the combustion of fossil resources were an integral part of a project of modernization that since the Industrial Revolution, starting in the late 18th century, has radically transformed our value system, our social institutions, and in this process, nature too. The desire to subject nature completely to human needs has been traced to the divine empowerment of Genesis 1:28, but this is a remote ancestor that for almost 2 millennia did not trigger any of the consequences ascribed to it. For even in monotheism, although perhaps to a lesser degree than in the pantheistic polytheism of a pagan world, nature, being God's creation, partakes in a holiness, the awe for which has proved to be one of the most powerful inhibitors of human conduct. And the disappearance of awe, I spoke yesterday briefly about it, is certainly a driving force of what we're witnessing today. We needed the replacement of this awe by a restless desire for new consumerist goods, a desire whipped up by modern technologies of advertising and manipulation in order to get where we are. It is first the disappearance of this awe. Second, Descartes' development of a new conception of human beings, no longer part of nature, but somehow opposed to it. And third, the noble desire to ease human suffering, expand the human lifespan, relieve the burden of hard physical work, and allow more people to enjoy commodities originally restricted to a small elite that have produced the world in which we live. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis already anticipates the scientific and technological revolutions which, together with the unleashing of trade and industrial capitalism, led to a self-reinforcing mechanism, further strengthened by the rise of a world market, democracy, and the welfare state. The success of a politician depends in such a system largely on economic growth, and the use of cheap energy was the easiest way to achieve such goals for the nation and re-election for oneself. For a long time, investment in fossil energies were understood as a generous renouncement of immediate consumption in order to render life smoother for future generations. Never forget that Kant still considered the true problem of intergenerational justice, the question on which grounds the present generation should make sacrifices for the benefit of our generation. That was for him the real problem of intergenerational justice. Not that we live at the expense of our generations, but that we are investing for our generation. But even after the deleterious consequences of certain investments could no longer be denied by informed and honest people, the decision to limit one's use of energy is inhibited on the individual level by at least 3 psychological factors. First, the undesirable consequences are not directly visible, at least they were not for a long time, and the effort of imagination requisite to fancy them is often beyond the intellectual and volitive powers of people. Second, even when this effort succeeds, the victims, such as people starving to death or forced to dangerous migrations, you heard this morning about it because of extending deserts in Africa or drowning on smaller Pacific islands because of the rise of seawater, are perceived to be far away in space and often also in time, and this did not enhance the motivation to use constraint. The good news is that this has begun to change in the last decades, even in countries like Australia and the USA, where harm hits now closer to home. Third, it is never my single individual contribution that triggers those consequences, but collective behavior. And if I am the only one who renounces a certain good, while others continue to enjoy it, I will be worse off, while no real benefit will accrue to humanity at large, since others will step in for me. This is the well-known tragedy of the commons. Beyond this psychological level, the 3 most prestigious social institutions of a modern world, sovereignty of states, market economy, and democracy, have proven, if not hostile, at least not conducive to the solution of a problem of limiting climate change. As just said, often the destructive consequences of one's behavior do not hit oneself, but people far away. And if these people are beyond the borders of a political unit, there is no easy mechanism to enforce a change, neither in the domestic political process nor in international law. It suffices to point to paragraph 52 of draft decision 21 of the 2015 Paris Agreement within the UNFCCC. Article 8 of the agreement, we read there, does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. That is the state of international law. There is the Warsaw mechanism, but it's it's very limited. But how about a country's own citizens? As long as they are not yet born, or at least not adult, it would be naive to assume that the market or the democratic process guarantees their rights. A true market, which must be defended by law against the formation of monopolies and oligopolies, is on the whole the most efficient mechanism to achieve an equilibrium of supply and demand for those who have purchasing power. But future generations do not have such power, and they do not have voting rights. Nobody represents them. It is therefore not at all surprising that we have not succeeded in institutionalizing justice between generations and between nations to the same degree that has been achieved with regard to justice between classes. Finally, it has to be mentioned that even among those who will in all likelihood be hit by the disastrous consequences of climate change, denial is not rare. Human inertia plays an important role since the social appreciation of certain activities is particularly hard to change. People do not like to acknowledge that what they and their parents cherished in the past, such as SUVs or expensive travels, was morally wrong. Furthermore, the complexity of the science involved in the decline of the trust in authorities of all kinds, including that of scientists, give denial of the fact an easy excuse. But while all this explains the enormous difficulties that we have in implementing intergenerational justice, which of course is not limited to climate justice, but represents a much broader concept, it does not change the fact that a behavior that creates considerable, probably enormous harm to people far away in space and or time is gravely unjust, even if it satisfies immediate interests of the agents. It is impossible to reduce justice to an equilibrium between selfish interests. True enough, thank you very much. True enough, people may agree about Pareto improvements based on purely selfish interests, if they are not yet in Pareto optimal situation. But it would be morally absurd to claim that only such moves are morally required. For the most horrific injustices may well be Pareto optimal. The basic principle of any acceptable moral theory is the recognition of the demands of justice as something irreducible to one's own interest. Justice demands the equal treatment of people and the recognition of the universality of norms, be they entitlements or prohibitions. Thank you so much. That's very, very kind. Deviations from these principles are inevitable in a differentiated society, but according to Rawls, they must be shown to be in the common interest. On the basis of such a universalistic ethics, it's clear that harming the life, health, property, and freedom of people spatially and temporally distant for the satisfaction of fleeting desires is immoral, even if one has to grant that the status of future generations entails complex ontological questions that do not concern contemporary and only spatially distant people. The focus on demands of justice toward other people does not exclude that there is an intrinsic value in non-human entities, particularly organisms and ecosystems, a value that is not reducible to their instrumental value for human purposes. A value does not lose its intrinsic nature if one holds a position that the recognition of such values enriches also the life of humans. But it is impossible to deny that in the case of conflict between a human and an animal life, the first, while not the only value, trumps the latter, since only humans can be moral agents. And in political discussions, it is probably wise to focus on justice between humans for the simple reason that a general agreement on this issue is more easily achieved. Not for the reason that in the Western tradition, the recognition of such an intrinsic value is less developed than in the Asian religion, the recognition of intrinsic value of nature. While the idea of justice is irreducible to selfish interest, human nature is so deeply flawed that it is morally imperative to render moral behavior on the whole compatible with individual interests. While morality will always ask for some form of self-sacrifice, we have to create economic, legal, and political systems in which a moral person does not become the victim and the immoral one, the successful usufructuary. The tragedy of the commons cannot be overcome without a reliable mechanism of negative sanctions against those who break the laws. Thus, the transformation of our morality into an attitude that accepts responsibility for the remote consequences of our behavior must be accompanied by far-reaching legal reforms. But what are the main institutional changes that moral policies have to bring about? I want to quickly mention changes in our concept of property, liability, taxes, and constitutional and international arrangements. The central idea from the point of view of universalist ethics can only be that both the use of resources and the emission of pollutants must be kept to a level that allows future generations to enjoy the same rights that the current generation is reaping the benefits of. While differentiations in property are just and inevitable as an incentive for work, it is hard to accept the idea that natural capital can become absolute property of a person or generation. For unwrought capital, natural capital is not made by human labor, the source of legitimate private property, but antecedes it. In the case of renewable resources, there can be no right to use the capital stock up. One can only harvest the interest. In the case of non-renewable resources, the argument does not work, for it would prevent any generation from using them, while a reasonable limitation is directed towards rendering such use possible for as many generations as possible. One will have to posit that the use of such resources must be compensated for by investments in alternative resources, which must increase the scarcer the first resource gets. Concerning the pollution rights, the cap of the acceptable global amount should be divided by the number of persons existing, each being entitled to the same environmental space. In order to avoid creating an incentive to further demographic growth, the UN should grant to the different countries the amount corresponding to the number of the inhabitants for a few decades, so that countries may not be induced to policies fostering population growth. Rights to pollution should be tradable in order to increase efficiency of allocation. In order to facilitate the transition to a closed-loop economy, it is reasonable to conceive buying an environmentally problematic product as a mere buying of the use of this product. Thus, when it does not work anymore, the producers should be obliged to take it back, since they are most familiar with the ingredients and best know how to utilize them. Whoever causes pollution must be liable for it and pay appropriate compensation, also in international court. Concerning the problem that most ecological disasters are caused by a complex web of agents, the answer can only be that institutions who contribute to ecological damage have to pay into a compensation fund according to the quota to which their activities have contributed to such damage. There will be difficulties in determining such partial contributions, but even a rough demarcation would be better than what we have now. Last two things. The democracy as we have it suffers from the fact that there is no organ representing future generations. How can we build such organs? Fundamentally, there are two possibilities. Either you have a group of what I would call trustees of future generations with scientific competence, who sit in parliament and have to take part in the decision process. The other possibility, which I, for various reasons, tend to favor, is to say that the Constitution should grant rights of future generations, and that the Constitutional Court, where it exists, is to be advised by such experts to oblige certain changes when the current policies are infringing on the rights of future generations. And on the international level, we will have to build up, in analogy to the Security Council of the United Nations, something analogous to an environmental council where the caps are determined by the international community. This is a long, long way, but if we don't move into that direction, we will be devoured.
Muchas gracias, profesor Hosle, por el aporte profundo sobre la justicia y la visión multidimensional de la ética en relación con el cambio climático. Le pediría al panel de control que ajusten el reloj porque están marcando 10 minutos por exposición y son 15 minutos. Entonces, para que no suene antes de tiempo, más allá del pequeño exceso que hubo en la exposición inicial. Damos ahora la palabra al doctor Soumya Swaminathan, espero haberlo pronunciado correctamente, que va a disertar sobre niños y mujeres. La palabra.
Gracias. Good morning, everyone. Could I have the slide mover, please, the remote? Thank you very much. And thank you to the Academy for organizing this wonderful meeting. And of course, for the audience with the Pope yesterday. So this morning's session, we already heard a good amount about the impacts on vulnerable communities, particularly women and children. And I'd like to continue on the same theme based on some experience in India and a recent scoping review that we did. And as I mentioned, very inspiring yesterday, and particularly to read the text of his speech, where the Pope also specifically mentions the disproportionate impacts on women and children. COP28 was the first COP, as we all know, that actually had a day dedicated to health, despite the fact that the WHO and Maria has been one of the champions for really looking at the health impacts as one of the major issues that we have to confront. In addition, of course, to the loss of other species. But this, unfortunately, it took 28 COPs for health really to be on the agenda, and the same with agriculture. But now, finally, they are on the agenda. While the health declaration at COP28 includes close partnerships with women and children, it does not really address the disproportionate impacts again. And again, quoting a WHO document on protecting maternal, newborn, and child health from the impacts of climate change, the effects of climate change on women's health are still underreported and underestimated. And I think this was also brought out by Professor Haynes and other speakers this morning. There have been various estimates, again, of the larger number of people that are going to be pushed into poverty, and again, more women and girls are going to be impacted. And according to UN Environment, 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women or girls. Now, climate change and global warming impacts health and health systems in many different ways. And starting from the bottom of this slide, you see the various changes in ecology, whether it's soil loss or whether it's global temperature rise in the water, on land, extreme weather events. All of these have impacts on the social and structural determinants of health and environmental determinants of health. And this, in turn, of course, affects health systems. We've seen repeatedly when there are floods, when there are disasters, that healthcare workers and health systems are as impacted as ordinary people living in those communities. And so we do need to think about how to strengthen health systems as well and make them climate resilient. And then on top, you can see the various impacts from heat, post-traumatic stress, the lung diseases and heart diseases due to air pollution, vector-borne diseases. So mosquitoes that spread dengue, for example, are adapting very rapidly and spreading around the world, increasing malnutrition and, of course, conflicts and migration. There's now a well-grounded basis for stating that the climate crisis is not gender neutral, and there are many different ways in which women and girls experience the impacts differently. Across the world, we know women have less access to natural resources. Land rights, for example, if you look across countries, you find that it varies. But in some countries, land rights, the difference between men and women, women have only about 10% of the land rights that men have. But this goes up to, say, 50, 60% in countries like Vietnam. We know that agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and low-middle income countries, and therefore anything that impacts their crops, like drought or erratic rainfall, they have to work harder to secure the same income. And of course, it's girls who often have to leave school to help their mothers to manage the increased burden. And even today, you travel in rural areas across Africa, across Asia, you will find the older girl sibling looking after the younger child when the mother has to go to work. There was a recent FAO report also called The Unjust Climate, and they have actually made some
estimates of the amount of losses, and again showing that female-headed households lost 8% more of their income every year than male-headed households with heat. This was 3% with floods. And so households run by women, the losses are much greater. And again, there's a prediction that if temperatures increase by a further 1 degree, then female-headed households could lose up to 34% of their income compared to male-headed households. And to the question, is there enough finance going towards supporting rural women in a changing climate? The answer is a resounding no. Only 6% of funds focused on agri-food systems actually are focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. And again, only 6% of national climate policies or the nationally determined contributions even mention women in a significant manner. We looked at state action plans for climate change in India that are derived from the National Action Plan and found that only 4 out of the 28 or so states actually had a truly gender-responsive climate action plan. So there is a substantial opportunity here to increase attention to gender equality, both within climate and agricultural policies. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But again, just looking at India as an example, and of course, India is a subcontinent. On the left-hand side, you see a slide which shows that 75% of Indian districts are vulnerable to what we call extreme hydromet events. In fact, this is a map produced by CEEW, that Arnaba was talking about yesterday. And, the losses run into $10 billion. I think Sunita also mentioned that last year, almost on every day of the year, there was one climate disaster somewhere in India or the other. The middle map really shows us where the heat waves are going to be very severely impacting people. And on the right-hand side, actually, is areas which have very high air pollution levels, the areas in red. The areas in green doesn't mean that they don't have they don't have poor air quality, they do. But the ones in red are like 10 times above, 8 to 10 times above the WHO cutoffs. You can imagine the millions and millions of people that live in those areas. Again, this comes from the Lancet countdown showing that, it's again numbers. Average summer temperatures have gone up. Conditions suitable for malaria now 1/3 of the year, when previously it was just the monsoons. 29% of India's land in the last decade experienced over 3 months of extreme drought, and a huge number of deaths in India attributable to high PM 2.5 generated from human activities. So again, all anthropogenic. Now, again, these are many ways in which women are impacted. UNDP estimates that women are 14 times more likely than men to die in a disaster. But crop failure, water scarcity, conflicts, lack of access to healthcare because women are spending more time either bringing water or firewood, and displacement, of course. Either women are migrating with the men or they're left behind in their villages while men migrate to urban areas, and both have different sets of issues. So I'll go quickly over some of these slides because we know, I think, and we can always go into more details on what the actual biological impacts are of each of these hazards and threats. But one of the analysis we did showed that women who live in districts in India that have been exposed to repeated droughts in the last 10 years not only had higher underweight, but the incidence of things like girl-child marriage, teenage pregnancies, and very staggeringly, intimate partner violence, domestic violence increased by a huge 26%. And again, there are intersectionalities always. It's not all women, of course, are not the same, and all women are not equally vulnerable. There are men, there are others elderly, there are disabled people who are also vulnerable. But when you combine the intersectionality of poverty, sometimes of religion or caste or other kinds of marginalization, and being a woman or a girl, then of course it all adds up. Again, we've heard about children this morning, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but again, the analysis we did on the impacts of exposure to either droughts, floods, or cyclones showed that things like child stunting, child underweight, even child mortality, diarrhea, child immunization, all of these, so we can see setbacks in many of the health indicators. So it's going to be more difficult to reach the SDG 3 goals and because of the impact on climate. Of course, education is also severely impacted and children. We already lost a lot of education during the pandemic, especially in, again, low middle income countries where schools were closed, and now there are further disruptions because of climate. Now, just switching over to why climate action needs women and children. So they're not just the victims and should not be considered victims, but really should have to be and are part of the solution. And there is data that you give women the same access to resources as men, for example, in agriculture, they can increase their agricultural yields significantly more. And we know that, I'll just take 2 more minutes, that indigenous women or tribal women have been at the forefront of environmental conservation, and they have a lot of invaluable knowledge and expertise that can help to build resilience. And again, I think we are going to hear from children this afternoon, so I won't go into let the children speak for themselves. But certainly women are agents of change. But unfortunately, when you look at data on women's representation, even if you look at the delegations to COP, I think it was, 10% or less of women. We look at delegations, to any of the UN high-level bodies, you look at parliaments, you look at decision-making bodies overall, women are underrepresented, and more so women from marginalized groups are not included. So we need much more inclusive, and I think that can be one of the recommendations, that decisions that are being made should not be made for people. They should really be involved in those decisions. Again, I don't have a lot of time, but some of the approaches we've taken, like farming systems for nutrition, where you involve women, you involve the communities in designing nutrition-sensitive agriculture that improves dietary diversity, ends up in improving nutritional outcomes, and makes them more climate resilient. I think those are the kind of co-designed solutions, which are going to vary by agroecological zone, but again, it needs a participatory approach. And while we were looking at examples across India, we saw several examples, and just 3 on this slide, of women-led solutions. Eco-sand toilets for areas in Jharkhand which get flooded every year, where women did not have access to toilets during the flooded season, so they built these elevated, very ecologically sensitive toilets. Climate resilient schools in Uttarakhand, it's a program that's a public-private partnership program, and then strengthening indigenous food systems, again, reviving the neglected and underutilized foods that tribal people or rural people use. But today, with the over-commercialization of food, many of those neglected and nutritious foods have been forgotten. So just to end, I think some thoughts for the future, and what we've learned is that national action plans, they must be gender transformative and must allocate resources specifically to address issues related to women and children. And large countries like India, state action plans need to do the same. We've heard a lot about cities. Certainly, pregnant women, young children there must be special provision to protect them from the impacts of heat and air pollution. And doctors and health ministries must really become advocates for policies and other sectors that will help mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change on health, whether it is transport, whether it's buildings, whether it's air quality. These actions need to be taken by other ministries, but the stewardship needs to be with the health departments. And we need vulnerability mapping at a granular level so that governments know what to act, where to act, and when to act. The increase in gender-based and intimate partner violence is extremely worrying, and so we need solutions, and obviously men need to be part of the solution, but and that's a complex, very complex issue. I think we heard yesterday that access to clean cooking fuel, this could be one of the low-hanging fruits that becomes a global priority, because again, not only is it good for climate, but it's also good for women's health. Livelihoods of rural, particularly agricultural women, need what we may call climate proofing, new technologies, skilling, green jobs, eco jobs, etc. We can use new technologies, but they must be shared equitably. And I was witness to the inequities during the pandemic, in the sharing of vaccines and other health products. Similar things I think one can see in climate change, where there are technologies around the world, but they're not necessarily being shared with people who might need them most urgently. And financing, I think we had a lot of discussion on how we need to really change the way that we're financing, rather than being in silos, but combine it to address multiple challenges. And finally, I think gender equality must be a very strong component, and we have to constantly remind people to include that and when we talk about solutions for climate change. Thank you very much.
PAPAYU, the Pan American Committee of Judges, and also is affiliated with the Instituto Bartolomé de las Casas, and is one of the highest judges of Argentina. He's the president of the institute, and he's also one of the highest judges of Argentina. So we are very honored that you're here and will speak about the Franciscan dimension, the Franciscan doctrine behind climate justice.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Tal vez este encuentro sea una de las últimas oportunidades que tengamos para hablar sobre el cambio climático en clave de mitigación. En un tiempo cercano, el único enfoque será cómo hacer para sobrevivir a una catástrofe planetaria ya consumada. Cuando en 1972 el informe del Instituto Tecnológico de Massachusetts, a pedido del Club de Roma, alertó sobre los límites del crecimiento, algunos buscaron interpretaciones forzadas para ilusionarse con un desarrollo sostenible. Pero no hubo magia ni hubo milagros. Sin cambios en la concepción económica de la producción y del consumo, en el crecimiento de la curva poblacional y en el uso de las energías disponibles, la crisis más temprano que tarde sobrevendría. Hoy padecemos el cambio climático, el agujero de ozono, la contaminación oceánica con microplásticos, la destrucción de las napas acuíferas, deforestación, contaminación por la práctica extractivista y muchos otros ejemplos de progresiva degradación planetaria. Paralelamente, en la década del 60, se consolidó una teoría económico-política que explicó las relaciones de subordinación entre el centro y la periferia. Con lujo de detalles se describió la dinámica de interconexión entre los países tecnológicos e industrializados y los que se encontraban en lo que eufemísticamente se denominó en vías de desarrollo. La dependencia de los estados pobres era una resultante inevitable de las asimetrías en el intercambio y de su escasa o nula soberanía política en la toma de decisiones económicas. El presente nos habla acerca de la vigencia, cuanto menos parcial, de ambas teorías. Estamos en la crisis climática producto de no haber entendido los límites del desarrollo y también frente a reglas de causalidad y de dependencia. Sin duda, la centralidad mundial es la gran responsable de la degradación ecológica. Los estados y las corporaciones más poderosas operan en todas las latitudes del planeta, destruyendo sin tregua a la naturaleza bajo el designio del desarrollo y arrastrando a poblaciones enteras a guerras y genocidios incalificables. Como contracara, cientos de millones de personas carecen de agua potable, de alimentos básicos, y ven cómo el cambio de clima afecta sus producciones, destruye sus cosechas, altera la calidad de sus frutos. Éxodos multitudinarios se producen en varias zonas del mundo en la búsqueda de zonas promisorias. Una gran mayoría migrante vive buscando y muere en la búsqueda. Infelizmente, las poblaciones hambriadas, que son simultáneamente saqueadas en sus riquezas naturales, no están en condiciones de asumir protagonismos de defensa ambiental. A duras penas pueden pensar en qué comer al día siguiente o dónde obtendrán agua. Por eso Francisco, el Papa gestado en el sur del planeta, con meridiana claridad nos habla de una única crisis ecológica y humanitaria. Esa mirada holística relaciona dialécticamente a la madre tierra con la sociedad humana y nos aproxima a la idea de injusticia ambiental. La injusticia ambiental de un mundo en donde un reducido porcentaje de la población, con su actividad económica, priva a la mayoría de recursos básicos y destruye además el hábitat, aniquilando el goce de los derechos más elementales. Solo los negacionistas y los libertarios radicales, encarnados en personajes mezcla triste de cómicos y desquiciados, pueden desconocer la crisis ambiental y sus consecuencias. Frente a esta injusticia estructural, los invito a dos preguntas y sugeriré alguna respuesta posible. La primera pregunta es, ¿ha sido eficaz el sistema judicial en el mundo para prevenir y restaurar el daño medioambiental? El presente nos habla de un pasado judicial fracasado, en donde a veces no se supo, en otras no se pudo y en muchas no se quiso actuar eficientemente. En general, se actuó sobre el daño consumado y con carácter restaurativo o meramente resarcitorio de los daños y perjuicios irrogados. Las compensaciones económicas, sin embargo, en pocos casos sirvieron para retrotraer las cosas a su estado original. El cambio climático no es sino una forma más de daño ecológico y su existencia es la contracara de la ineficacia normativa y judicial. Para ser eficaz, el aparato judicial debería en el futuro actuar ex ante y no sobre los hechos consumados. También debería darse una necesaria correspondencia entre el carácter global del accionar dañoso y su correlativa prevención y castigo. No existen los daños ambientales nacionales. El carácter sistémico de nuestro hábitat hace imposible la determinación de fronteras para la evaluación de los efectos. Se puede avanzar entonces en un pacto ecológico internacional que penalice el daño medioambiental mediante la aplicación de un principio ya antiguo, aunque no muy utilizado, que es quien contamina, paga. Procesalmente podría generarse un nuevo segmento de tribunales de primera instancia internacional con competencia en materia ambiental en todos los estados partes, tribunales de apelación de carácter regional y una corte internacional especializada como la última instancia recursiva. Las decisiones judiciales resultantes podrían asimismo ejecutarse en el lugar de los hechos por vía de comunicaciones internacionales. Por otra parte, las sanciones preventivas o resarcitorias se podrían ampliar a todos aquellos puntos del planeta en donde las empresas o los estados contaminantes operan, sean o no pertenecientes al lugar de la lesión. Multiplicar las competencias de los tribunales y hacerlos en la práctica transnacionales serviría para evitar posibles situaciones de corrupción, cohecho o la simple presión política sobre los jueces facilitada por la proximidad entre los juzgadores y los causantes del daño ambiental. Las experiencias de jurisdicción universal han tenido recepción en algunos casos de delitos de lesa humanidad, genocidios y corrupción. Me pregunto, ¿por qué no habría de tener cabida cuando se está decidiendo sobre la continuidad de la vida en el planeta? ¿Acaso el daño ecológico no podría ser considerado un crimen de lesa humanidad? La segunda pregunta es, ¿puede ser posible la mitigación del cambio climático si se prescinde de la transformación de la cultura económica? La respuesta que quisiera dejar aquí planteada tiene un perfil sustantivo y creo que es más atinente al ámbito en el que nos encontramos en esta academia, considerando las diversas posturas que se plantearon en las jornadas previas. El daño que se le irroga al planeta no es producto de una casualidad. El sistema económico mundial, con sus subsistemas productivo, energético, industrial, financiero, bancario, monetario, comercial y otros de menor jerarquía, es el principal causante de este verdadero desmadre ecológico. Francisco lo dijo con claridad en su discurso en Santa Cruz de la Sierra, en Bolivia, en el 2015, y lo profundizó en la encíclica Laudato Si. El sistema está agotado. No puede, tal como ha sido y es concebido, brindar ninguna solución duradera a este crítico estado de cosas. El gran desafío es diseñar un nuevo sistema que ponga fin a esta crisis civilizatoria a la que hoy estamos expuestos. Cuando el Papa sugirió, en buen porteño, que es el idioma de Buenos Aires, hagan lío, hacer lío, nos invitó justamente a pensar en alternativas transformadoras, en cambios profundos, en verdaderas revoluciones ecológicas y sociales, a crear para grandes males grandes soluciones. En el libro que tuve oportunidad de escribir, Francisco versus Moloch, Ideas para una revolución ecosocial, me pregunté, allá por el año 2018, si sería posible la sustitución de la economía fiduciaria por la economía energética. Hoy estoy convencido que esa podría ser una de las alternativas que la humanidad explorase para sortear el actual derrotero catastrófico. El sistema monetario, tal como lo vivimos hoy, el reinado de la tasa de ganancia, el privilegio del mercado, la prevalencia de lo financiero, por su carencia de base real, deberían sucumbir y dar paso a un sistema nuevo que integrase la morfología del fenómeno económico con la tecnología actualmente disponible. Este nuevo paradigma económico podría resultar de la mensura energética de toda actividad humana. El hombre produce y consume energía. La naturaleza provee energía. La energía es un patrimonio esencialmente común. La tecnología, por su parte, nos permitiría hoy, con el concurso de los recursos informáticos y de la inteligencia artificial, mensurar detalladamente y efectuar todas y cada una de las conversiones, adaptaciones y correcciones por coeficientes necesarias para dar viabilidad a un sistema de intercambio social de energía eficiente y limpio. En este orden de ideas, ¿sería posible integrar esa realidad energética con la tecnología en un orden económico que pueda mensurar las contribuciones humanas y medir y controlar las producciones energéticas, racionalizar adecuadamente el consumo y propender a una distribución equitativa? Creo que sí. No se trataría solamente de cuestionar la arcaica idea del dinero, sino de toda la lógica económica actual. Junto con esa idea antigua del dinero, sucumbirían en un nuevo paradigma económico energético las tradicionales ideas de mercado, de oferta, de demanda, de escasez, de precio, valor, capital, plusvalor, salario, clases sociales en la descripción ortodoxa del marxismo y propiedad privada. Todo eso sucumbiría frente a este nuevo paradigma. Si hemos sido capaces de sostener, auxiliados por la tecnología informática, una economía ficcional que, mal que nos pese, domina el mundo, ¿cómo somos incapaces de aplicar estos conocimientos para dar vida a un sistema basado en la realidad energética? Infelizmente, por falta de tiempo, no puedo profundizar este análisis. Para aquellos que tengan interés, les sugiero la lectura, que hay una descarga gratuita por internet, del texto Francisco versus Moloch. No sé si las preguntas previas que me formulé fueron del todo atinentes y si las respuestas fueron suficientes y seguras. Pero tengo dos certezas. La catástrofe planetaria se está gestando y nuestro tiempo para conjurarla es muy escaso. Queridos todos, así como algunos desarrollan naves espaciales para huir de un planeta Tierra al que destruyen y ya dan por muerto, los que amamos la vida dada por Dios en todas sus formas, tenemos que hacer lo imposible para unirnos, encontrar alternativas y ponerlas en funcionamiento. Ese y no otro es nuestro desafío y esa es la propuesta de nuestro Papa, el Papa Francisco. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Judge Cajado, for this very impressive talk that brought us into the structural transformation dimension besides the one of mitigation and adaptation that we had addressed at the beginning. It's my pleasure now to invite Professor Stefano Stamani, one of Italy's most distinguished economists, who has contributed a lot to the evolution of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church and who has been the president of the Academy until recently. Stefano, the floor is yours.
Forgive me. Otherwise, yes. Thank you, Vittorio. Now, in this presentation, I would like to focus my attention on a specific point out of the many points that have been tackled with in these 2 days, etc. The point is briefly the following. In addition to the necessary mitigation policy and adaptation policies, we should start considering also the transformation policy. Mitigation policies, as we know, aim at the progressive elimination of anthropogenic factors that produce the Earth's temperature increase, thereby reducing climate risk. In other words, bending the warming curve down with the adoption of nature-based solutions. On the other hand, adaptation policies aim to protect health, human society, and the natural environment from the impacts of climate pressures on them. In other words, such policies tend to reduce the exposure and vulnerability to unavoidable climate risk by enhancing adaptive capacity. All this remains valid and therefore necessary, but I do believe that they are not sufficient. The time is come to take into serious consideration transformation policies, whose ultimate target would be to modify, first, the lifestyle, second, to enact mass education in ecological citizens, third, to actively involve civil society organization, fourth, to enhance a major engagement of science, both natural science and social economic science, and fifth, updating the institutional setup of our market economy. So let me elaborate briefly on these basic points. Now, a fundamental, if I haven't left the paper, so I skip the quotations and the sources. If you are interested, you can find in the paper. A frequent question today is the following. Are policies designated to avert climate change politically costly? Because that is one of the major points yesterday those governors and mayors who intervened stressed. Now, a very recent accurate research, piece of research by OECD finds that climate change policies not necessarily are politically costly. So, and they provide a lot of empirical evidence to do that, to say so. So, if so, how can we explain the hesitancy of politicians in this regard? In other words, why, apart from few exceptions, governments remain hesitant despite the availability of effective ways to intervene on climate change and the related matters? It seems to me that one answer has to do with the following question. As we know, the problem turns out to choose the transition pathway from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium that all of us want to achieve. three potential transitions can be devised. Under a first scenario, which is called accelerated transition, the current energy crisis would trigger a green transition starting immediately, thereby allowing economies to reach emissions reduction by 2030 that were compatible with the 1.5 Celsius degree maximum target at the end of the century. Under the second scenario, which is called the late push transition, recent adverse macroeconomic developments would lead to a green transition starting next year. It would be sufficiently intense to achieve similar emission reduction by 2030, thanks to strong and decisive actions, albeit also with higher cost than under the first scenario. Finally, under the third scenario, which is called the delayed transition, the transition itself would start with a delay of 3 or 4 years from now and would be smoother, therefore being less costly. However, emissions would be on a path only compatible with a temperature increase of around 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, Fed, American Fed, European Central Bank, OECD have recently released a very important report in this regard, where they try to evaluate the pros and cons of the three scenarios. And as you know, the implementation of the scenario is a typical political business, political duty. Now, the results of these exercises show that acting immediately and decisively, in other words, adopting the accelerated transition scenario, would provide significant benefits for firms, households, and the financial system, not only by maintaining the economy on the optimal net zero emission path, and therefore limiting the impact of climate change, but also by rapidly reducing their energy expenses and lessening the financial risk. If the transition, on the other hand, is further delayed, the only way to reduce emissions compatibly with the net zero targets would be to act more intensively at a later stage. And this raises an issue of intergenerational justice, as Vittorio in his presentation a few minutes ago said, with an abrupt and strong transition that would lead to a weaker economy and higher annual expected losses for the financial system over the horizon set for this exercise. So the results also show an orderly and smooth transition, but starting with a 3 years delay, as I said, would lead by 2030 to risk levels comparable to those implied by an immediate and accelerated transition. However, emission reductions would clearly undershoot the policy goal of a maximum rise in temperature of 1.5%, accelerating the impact of physical risk in the long term. Now, in this regard, a special big problem, at least from my point of view, is the following. While the ecological transition is universally perceived as a need that can no longer be postponed, the global south is driven back into the arms of fossil fuels in the name of debt. And that is a really serious problem. This is what the British organization called Debt Justice denounces in its report, which was published 2 months ago. From 2010 to 2021, the public debt of the countries of the global south has doubled its weight on GDP, rising from 35% to 60% of their domestic product. And that increased not only to domestic creditors, but also to foreign creditors. From 2010 to 2000 today, the share of public debt to foreign creditors increased by 10 percentage points from 19 to 29th of the gross domestic product. The conclusion is that from 2011 to today, the sums disbursed by the Global South in payment of foreign debt increased by 150%, reaching unprecedented peaks. The United Nations estimates that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on health and education. These are facts, are not theories or hypotheses. And since many of these sums have to be paid in dollars or euros because they are owed to foreign creditors, the problem for each country is not only to increase its tax revenues, but also to increase its export earnings. Some countries, by now with a good industrial apparatus, can try to push manufactured exports, but the less industrialized ones have no choice but to increase the exports of natural resources, including coal, gas, oil. Roughly half of the 66 least developed countries have fossil fuels in their subsoil and are planning to extract more of them to meet their financial commitments. Moreover, among the creditors of the South, that are also states and companies, that in order to protect themselves against the risk of non-payment, have provided for the possibility of being paid directly in kind through the delivery of oil or the transfer of ownership of wells held by debtor government. This is a really tragic problem. Despite multiple declarations by governments and institutions in the North that they no longer want to finance fossil fuels extraction, many of these countries in the North continue to provide loans to open new production sites in the South. According, again, to Debt Justice, in the last 3 years, the multilateral banking system, of which the World Bank is the leader, granted a total of US $10 billion, in loans for fossil fuel extraction. And history will tell whether it was a bargain for the Global South to go into debt to increase fossil fuel production. But right now, we can say that it is a better deal from an environmental point of view, because the increased carbon dioxide emissions that will result will worsen an already bad picture. So now you understand why changing the rules of the economic and financial games at the international level, it is impossible to find a solution. We can mitigate, we can adapt, but we'll. So to conclude, what I would like to stress is that perhaps time has come to speak in defense of a World Environmental Organization, which does not exist yet. We have many international organizations established in 1944 at Bretton Woods, but not. And without such an organization, it would be impossible to solve the so-called political trilemma. The trilemma consists in putting in harmony the three dimensions of the sustainability issue: the environmental dimension, economic dimension, and the social dimension. And that is why in meetings like the present ones, in my opinion, are important. And we need to circulate the work of these 3 days in order to push. Also because this September, as you know, in New York, the United Nations will organize an extraordinary assembly, the title of which is a Pact for the Future. And if you look at the agenda of the assembly, one of the points is exactly this one: to establish a World Environmental Organization. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor y maestro, expresidente Stefano Samagni. Ahora es el turno de escuchar al colega, vecino de la República Federativa de Brasil, vecino mío, el juez del Tribunal Superior de Justicia, Antonio Herman Benjamin. Muchas gracias, doctor, su palabra.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say that this is the third time I come to the Academy, the first two times invited by Monsieur Marcelo Sanchez Torondo, and this time by Cardinal Peter Turkson. And what I intend to do here in my paper is to read from a legal perspective three main documents that were released by Pope Francis. Laudato Si from 2015, Fratelli Tutti from 2020, and finally the Apostolic Exhortation Laudate Deo from 2023. I am the president of the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment that brings together Supreme Court justices from around the world, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the Institute. So I'd like to emphasize this point. My paper has three objectives, and I will cover only two of them here today. The first objective, as I already alluded to, is to search for the legal foundations and repercussions in those three documents. In the first time I was invited here, I focused on Laudato Si only. It was already very complicated. And now focusing on three and trying to merge the different concepts that they bring together. The second goal of my paper is to analyze in those three documents how they understand resilience, and resilience from a moral perspective, from a scientific perspective, and what interests me the most, from a legal perspective. And because I'm not going to discuss this point, let me say up front that resilience is a concept that is alien to law, or at least it was alien to law until very recently. In fact, we operate on the basis that it's not the role of law, and especially the role of judges, to enhance resilience in people or in assets, but to protect them as they are, to protect the status quo. And as the co-chair of this panel alluded to, also to redress damage that eventually has been done to those assets or to those people. So let's begin with the first point that I will address here today. Reading the three documents, what can we extract from those three documents from a legal perspective? And I apologize here for the scientists, to the scientists, to the philosophers, or those that have a spiritual background, because I'll be selfish. I'll be looking at the documents from a legal perspective. But of course, the legal perspective is not there in isolation. It is in dialogue with those other perspectives. The first concept in those three documents, and let's emphasize here, Laudato Si is an ecological message with a social and climate underpinning. Fratelli Tutti is a social document, and economists will say also an economic document, with environmental and climate underpinning. And Laudate Deum is a climate document with social and ecological underpinning. It's just, in my view, I might be completely wrong, is the difference among the three is on the focus, but not on the ethical, scientific, and legal foundations of the three documents. If we look at those three documents, the first concept that resonates directly with law is, and I quote Laudato Si, and I could quote in the other documents too, it's quoting our common home, unquote. This is in the appeal of the Pope in Laudato Si, and it comes up everywhere in those three documents. And as you know, or those are not familiar with law, home is a very powerful concept in law. All the way from criminal law, the home is protected, to family law, to tax law, to the law of obligations, home is very important. It's tangible and intangible. The question here that unfortunately I don't have much time to explore, but it is in the paper, is what does the Pope understand by home? Is it home, like we are here, a building, or is it something else? Or is it many things other than just a construction, a material construction? And what I can extract, and I invite you to go back, the three documents, is that that Pope Francis had a concept of home as space. This is familiar to law, but not entirely familiar. We are going to see in a minute. It's home as a time concept, and this is very familiar to law, and it is home among species. And this is entirely unfamiliar or even alien to law. So let's begin as home or with home as a protected space. And this is, this version of home is everywhere in the three documents. I will not spend too much time because this is probably the easiest connotation of home in the three documents. But it's not entirely the easiest one, because the Pope does mention, and I'm quoting from Fratelli Tutti, quoting neighbors without border, unquote. So this is home beyond the home. And this is home that goes much beyond a geographic perspective of home. And it brings in the concept of neighborhood that's traditional in law, trespass in common law, or droit de voisinage in French. But it is not the physical neighbor anymore that is being protected. It is the ecological neighbor, but not the ecological neighbor in a single biome. Somebody here said, and use another terminology, biozone, but it is the biosphere neighbor. You see this, the huge expansion of the concept of neighborhood in those three documents. But it's also expanded from a subjective perspective, not just from an objective perspective, but from a subjective perspective. In order to include future generations, this is traditional in law, no, not controversial in other areas of law, not so much in new fields of law, but it includes so future generations and then other species as well. So you see, we move from the traditional concept of home to expand into the whole biosphere, future generations, other species. At the end of the day, those three documents are protecting the community of life. All living organisms, but also the foundations of life as we find in the German Constitution. Let me move now to the second key concept, in my view, in those three documents. And it's related to this one, which is the, and I quote, the principle of common good, unquote. This is almost lunch and dinner in ethics, but not so much in law. And the way we should read that concept in those three documents is that the Pope is speaking of the traditional concept of common good, meaning not individual goods, common, but good, going beyond assets. And this changes the property right equation in the three documents, and I'll speak about that in a minute. So I think the Pope is also talking about the common bad. So it's not just the common good. We are familiar with the common good, things that have value to more than one person, to a community, or to the whole world. But also, we should be aware that there is a common bad. Things, actions, or omissions that in the past were individually even criminalized because they would cause damage to one individual or to a few individuals, now they are the common bad because they can affect the whole planet and the community of life as such. The other, my time is, but I still have 4 minutes. So the other very important point from those three documents with legal repercussions is, I quote, it's from Laudato Si, the conviction that everything in the world is connected, unquote. It's the holistic approach. But in law, we feel more comfortable in splitting things, splitting people, splitting space, and that's why me and my colleague Andres Gallardo enjoy what we call jurisdiction. So on one side of the river is one judge. On the other side of the river, it's an entirely different judge. Can be one state judge on one side and the federal judge on the other side. One that knows about environmental law, the other one that hates environmental law. It's more interested in tax law. That's legitimate. So we split space, we split people in order to facilitate the delivery of justice. But we might end up delivering injustice instead of justice, and especially injustice for the environment. Let me move into the conclusion, and unfortunately, I cannot say much as I planned about us judging. And I entirely echo the criticism that Andres has made of us. We judges don't think that we should be criticized. We are above that. That's not true. There are judges and more that invite criticism because we want to play by the same rules that we require to other people. So let me finish perhaps with just listing 2 more or 3 more concepts that to me are central to your timer is different from my Apple phone. I thought I still had 2 more minutes. Yeah, okay, so if I can have 2 more minutes. So 3 more concepts. I'm not going to expand on them, but because they were mentioned by the 2 co-chairs, I would like to emphasize that. In Fratelli Tutti, more than in Laudato Si and in Laudate Deum, the concept of the social role of property. And this has played a major role, especially in civil law countries. It's almost communism in the United States and in other countries, but it's in the constitutions of most Latin American countries, and I would say in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, in continental Europe. But what the Pope really meant, I think, is not just the social function of property rights, it's the ecological function of property, which is an entirely different dimension, and this has been recognized by case law in Latin America and in Asia more recently. Let me finish with 2 direct use that those 3 documents make of law. So you would not expect documents like those to use law, but to teach about law. But here, it is said in Laudato Si, and it was said here today, that, I quote, human rights are not equal for all, unquote. So the terminology of human rights and the concept of human rights and the problems of human rights are incorporated into those 3 documents, and especially in Fratelli Tutti. And to me, the most beautiful direct use of legal language and constitutional language is when the Pope, in Fratelli Tutti, states, I quote, every human being has the right to live with dignity. This is almost common sense in all constitutions, almost all constitutions of the world. But then the Pope goes beyond and invites us, I suppose, to constitutional reform. And he says, and develop integrally. Because having the right to live with dignity, what is that? If you add the last part and develop integrally, everything becomes much more comprehensive, holistic, and I would say civilized. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, mi querido juez Benjamín, en su alocución que pretendió ser muy jurídica, pero también fue filosófica y poética. Así que muchas gracias. Vamos a escuchar ahora al jefe Raoni Metutire del pueblo Kayapó de la Amazonia brasileña.
But me morning or maturity. Me will boy come. Me papa maja fina moro ba me will boy come. Ikin. And ba me mamia de tania.
A todos. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui com vocês. Bom dia a todos. Alô, oi. Funciona. O cacique Raoni falou, bom dia a todos, eu estou muito feliz de estar aqui com vocês, aqui no Vaticano.
Tania, a minha mãe, mana, naga meia ka, mana, meia ko kene dia. Naga me Brazil ka meia mane. Naga, dubekute ba kru ikori ka jikin. Ba kuni ne me ikori. Kai ma finkrai noi ne kune mukune. You come, I don't ulu amikrai. Ba me mane Tania.
Eu sei que vocês que são do exterior, fora do Brasil, são consumidores do que é produzido no Brasil. E para isso, para produzir alimentos, no Brasil é feito desmatamentos enormes para fazer produção. E isso está gerando consequência lá no Brasil.
No, amene be me ba keteri me ba ko amare kuda minin keteri kuda me ba ko amani fe joi ne me ba ko ni me ga me ba ko ni me ba ko ama tipo de meu menino. Yani iba ingin kukuakan mima ada bak kuma kunima tania.
Todos nós tivemos uma única origem, do nosso único Criador, que criou todos nós. Assim, meu pai me contou, assim meu avô me contou.
Tania, ba me mane? Meimo de ba me kuni mane na ba me be ku be mo ika benyane na ba me be ko kre I joi mo ika benyane. Amene be me ba ku ka mo ku ta ben paro mono. Ya aru ke. Ya ne Orlando wile bo wa me krao jo wile bo wa ri mo. Kunia ne ba ku ma. I ba kuta imane ko imane yo te ba kuma kane ba ima me kuta ben pari ima ke ne me kuta moya fulu ba ima ke kumne tania.
Eu falo sobre isso não só para os brancos, mas também para meu povo indígena. Eu sei que antigamente o povo indígena também brigava, fazia guerras. Assim meu pai me contou. Os irmãos Vilas Boas também me contaram muito sobre isso. E para a nossa geração de hoje, eu penso que não deve continuar com esse tipo de conflitos, guerras que vem acontecendo.
Tania, yan ba ye me mane mo? Are papa mane. No bom papa mo ku kijaga mana Brazil ka me akota bejoi me akota bejoi ne me mana congressa kamari me ka ngoyo ba puka me ka ngoyo ba no bom ku mane yowane me imone ba me akuni mane nyaroi ba Ada na ba me mo ka ben kono ti me ja ne yo o mo. Ada wa mi ka tu. Ada ba mi ka tu. Ia ka ie mari ka. Ie o mu ka. Ie mari ka ne ne me. Ia ka bu me ne ba ku ni a ben ko. Ada ba ku ya. Me ma ne you me ne I say a toro kid. Pinkraja toro kid. Nene kute pino eno ya. Tama ite oa for kamri oa pa. Puka jom nene kama ite muya kare nyumri ba kuru ya nenya toro kid. Pia toro kid tani ya.
Eu falei para o Papa sobre isso. Eu falei para o Papa, pedi para que ele, a Igreja, o Congresso Nacional, que também tem cristão no Brasil, que ataca muito povos indígenas, para eles parar de fazer esse tipo de ataque. É isso que eu sempre venho falando, desde que comecei quando eu era mais novo. Agora eu estou muito cansado dessa minha luta. Eu penso que, se todos concordarem, se todos nós concordarmos, nós temos que preservar agora o que resta de floresta no Brasil e não fazer mais desmatamento, e sim usar as mesmas terras que já estão desmatadas para produzir alimentos, mas não continuar com o desmatamento de nenhuma floresta.
Ene jumari jor ba me mo ane. Me mo. Me bakuni abeno ba fia ba ya beno banyo bi kwa kumene ka jun ba. Jumari jonya. Aro ye yu iwo boy ne kutai mo ka benyane kam ne vai mo me ya be. Imo me akine Ibo mea yo ipia, mea bena jolo, mea beku mea bena jolo, o ipia ye, mea wori ngie ikam ye, a tema mea nyo bena jolo, mo ika ben pundu o yare ketie, mea nyo bena jolo, o ika ben, yare ket, ne ba ika tot, mea kuni mo ika bena ne yaro ibar, aro mo amikato. Mesmo, me vacunia ben kabaki mo de baya ika ben ya ne yo mo ta ne ya.
Assim penso, e eu penso bem para todos. Eu quero que fique tudo bem com todos nós. Temos que ter a paz, porque eu também já sonhei com o Criador, que chamam de Jesus, e recebo mensagens boas também. Eu respeito todos vocês e peço que também vocês respeitem nós, povos indígenas, para que nós possamos viver em paz. Assim, quando eu encontro com os líderes de vocês, eu falo sobre isso. Eu penso no bem viver de todos. Nós, indígenas, vocês, temos que viver de forma harmônica e em paz.
Tania, mana onju jaba me mana ka me ka ben ma mana yang kan ko me bakuni me kute boya jul ngri mo ada aben kot baka ben na ne yote ku me ada kote onju jaba me mana ka me mal mana me kan ka me ya ai moya ni pe ka ju anyo pio ne me pego kren ba me amle be are me ba ife jo ya lo kute me pego kren jo mo me tu ma peña kre you can photo ke me ore me no ang no me be a fe ya ku ni oi ye me ma ari bena jo le ma ne que ya ba oye ka me ben fali ko tabaco bun kunga ni Neka oa minyo kana ba me mana inyo mo ya ker ba me ma neka me ma. Gija ba me ma neka me biri ika ben mane. Gija ka me bengo kre mo me ko kangon me mo pio kayo ko rane ba me oa mi puga ya ka be ka me umari me ka me tau jo abata ne kamu umari me ne única gente marwane yaka meia mané tanea.
Hoje estamos aqui falando sobre o problema que está acontecendo, problema de meio ambiente e também sobre desmatamento. Temos que fazer com que seja interrompido o trabalho de desmatamento das florestas. Eu sei que o trabalho de vocês só acontece quando tem dinheiro para pagar pelo trabalho. Nós indígenas, a gente não tem esse tipo de trabalho. Não trabalhamos com dinheiro na forma cultural nossa. Era para a gente ter desenvolvido, mas os portugueses foram para a nossa terra, dominaram a nossa terra e utilizaram de tudo que é de conhecimento e recurso que tem na nossa terra. Então, por isso que a gente está resgatando novamente o que é nosso. Por isso que eu quero pedir apoio de todos que estão aqui para ajudar nós, povos indígenas, a trabalhar, a financiar nossos projetos. Nós precisamos de apoio de vocês com financiamento para a gente proteger os nossos territórios e garantir o bem viver de nós, povos indígenas.
Tarea, depois meia mari aí. Mana me babam koi ko kan ariba. Me bakuni. Mam. Me acabei com me com Deus. You be me barba me com me babam me banhi feijoinha. No vamos me vai banhi feijoinha mo acabei na Joana. Iji na koi kwa meltum me baku ka motum uka me wa maro melte me mangare ro ja nyu me uni koi mo nyu uni koi mo ja ai te uka me o chere uka fog mon me baku ka mare kuni chere nyu mai te me ulten me mangare yare yo ja nyu me kuni koi moi ai te tin num ngere ka me manega me ma ngere ne ta me be me bi ku noro ta me be me bi ku noro yu mu me ko chi le to ai me ne ya pa yu mu me ko chi le to ai me ne ya pa no ta me be me bi ku noro ta me be me bi ku noro naga me ko chi le to ai me ne ya pa naga me ko chi le to ai me ne ya pa no yori mo yori mo yori mo puka no mumba me wa toi ka to aro me kunia te tine ai te ngo me o tam ngo me ba ku wa mare kunibi you mai te me o ka to me tine ku kem na mia amini tote gejara ini me ba kunibi ane ku te me ba ka ju mi mari me ba kuni ka ju ka tane deu me ba ka ju mi mari me kan pol ani ku be mi ba mara che ve sa kon ai bon kam on bi kwa pan ya make it. I'm the by making it. You're complete. You're complete company. I don't mana grabe ye you would boy. What I ang mere kaya niya ka ben kaya niya ka ben mo ye you mo neba me mo niya roy ba ang mere ali. Yun ka ma taniya.
Gitu, ini akaben yang mutape ini. Yang kejaba akaben yang ini que ali mesmo yang habita. O nosso Criador, o Pai de todos, a quem vocês conhecem como Deus, nós o chamamos de Criador, porque Ele criou nós. E Ele, há muito tempo, meu pai me contou que os nossos ancestrais, eles tiveram um problema. Teve água que matou todos, teve fogo que matou todos, e ele ressuscitou todos. Ele cantou aqui, segundo a história de nós de Caiapó, como é que foi feito. E, pelo que eu estou vendo, estão acontecendo as coisas. Enchentes, secas, fogos. E nós podemos ter problemas maiores ainda para todos nós. O Deus, o Criador que vocês conhecem como Deus, Ele só quer que a gente viva bem, em paz, um respeitando o outro. Eu sonhei com Jesus, então, assim são as minhas mensagens. Por isso que eu só quero pedir paz para vocês, só quero que a gente viva bem. E perguntou se você está entendendo. É isso. Então, é isso que ele falou.
Ang medali, ang nilali ya bit ba me mane me akuniot tum na do bika ben oi no re tania.
Well, we had a plan for a discussion, but I just spoke with our president, and I think it is better we, as a sign of gratitude and respect for this wonderful presentation, stop the discussion, have now 2 hours for rest and recovery, and we can then bring up the questions that were proposed earlier this morning in our final discussion. I think it would not be appropriate now to add the discussion session.